Yes or no to this statement? China does capitalism better than America. I'm John Donvan. Welcome to another debate from Intelligence Squared US. We have four superbly qualified debaters, two teams of two, who will argue for this motion and against this motion. We go in 3 rounds of debate, then the audience votes to choose the winner, and only one team wins. Our debaters, each connected in his own way to the China story. Orville Schell, who heads the Center for U.S.-China Relations at the Asia Society. Your partner is Peter Schiff, who heads Euro-Pacific Capital and who has advised Ron Paul. On the side arguing against the motion that China does capitalism better than America, Ian Bremmer, founder and president of Eurasia Group. And your partner, Minxin Pei, professor of government at Claremont McKenna College. We have explained that we want to have you vote 2 times tonight. You, our live audience, serve as our judges. We have you vote now. We have you vote again at the end of the debate to tell us which side you think is actually presented the better argument. So if you go to the keypads at your seat, our motion is China does capitalism better than America. On to round one. Round one is opening statements from each debater in turn. These statements are uninterrupted. To speak first for the motion, Peter Schiff, CEO for Euro-Pacific Capital. He writes books. He has a radio show. The radio show is named after you. So there's no burden of false modesty or reticence here. Luckily for us, ladies and gentlemen.
I'm the only one on the show.
Ladies and gentlemen, Peter Schiff.
As was stated, China is a communist nation in name only. It's not communist in the way the Soviet Union was communist. And unfortunately, China kind of gives communism a good name in a way that we give capitalism a bad name. And I thought maybe a more appropriate way to have framed this debate is not, does China do capitalism better, but it might be, does America do capitalism worse than China? Because neither modern America or China does capitalism anywhere near as well as we did it in the 19th century. But the problem is China is closer to what America used to be than America is today. If you look at taxes, which is a real measure of freedom, back in America in the 1900s, we had no income taxes. We had no corporate income tax, no state income taxes. Americans were truly free in the sense that they got to keep the production, the fruits of their labor. If you look at modern America and modern China, taxes are very high. They're just a lot higher here than they are in China. Also, if you look at the regulatory environment in both China and the United States, I would argue that a young entrepreneur in America today is going to face much greater hurdles, bigger obstacles in his path that have been placed there by the government than you would have in China. The cost of complying with all the rules and regulations in America exceeds the costs in China. And not just the rules and regulations, but surviving the litigation that is a byproduct of those rules and regulations. If you looked at China and the United States and just compare the results of their economy, China is today the world's largest creditor nation. America is the world's biggest debtor nation. China has large trade surpluses. America has enormous trade deficits. So if you thought about them as a nation, China has got, if you thought about the nation as a country, or as a corporation rather, China has a lot of assets on its balance sheet and lots of income, lots of profits. America is loaded up with liabilities and we're hemorrhaging red ink. So if you think that America is more capitalist than China, or China is more socialist, then you must think that socialism is a better economic system, because after all, the Chinese are more successful if you want to measure it by the accumulation of assets, by the positive balance of trade. And more importantly, they are accumulating massive savings. If you look at China, they have a savings rate of close to 50%. We have a savings rate of basically negative. In fact, we rely in America on a Ponzi scheme called Social Security. They don't have Social Security in China. They don't have a lot of these big government programs that we have in the United States. Look at our monetary system. We have the Federal Reserve price fixing interest rates at practically zero and all the macroeconomic imbalances that we create, we micromanage our economy through our tax code. We've got the U.S. government subsidizing or guaranteeing almost 100% of all the mortgages in the United States. So it's not up to the free market. Credit isn't being allocated by the market, it's being allocated by government. The government is deciding who should get money and who shouldn't get money, and who it should subsidize and who it should penalize. It does all of this through the tax code and through the Federal Reserve. Yes, you've got something similar going on in China, only in China I think it's a more above board. And when you have the U.S. government taking such an enormous share of our GDP and taking such an enormous share of our taxes, of our output in taxation, and then trying to regulate it and micromanage it from Washington, D.C., we're not even close to being a capitalist country anymore in the United States. The unfortunate thing is that China is closer, but what's more important is the direction in which the pendulum is swinging. In China, it's swinging towards capitalism. Unfortunately, in America, it's swinging away.
Thank you, Peter Schiff. Our motion is China does capitalism better than America, and our next debater is going to speak against the motion. Ian Bremmer, his company Eurasia Group, makes its money by helping companies figure out when investing overseas is risky or not, and so being right about China is practically his business model. Ladies and gentlemen, Ian Bremmer.
Getting China right is hard. And one thing we do all need to admit is that the level of volatility in outcomes in China over the next 10 to 20 years is vastly greater than the level of volatility in the United States or in Europe or Japan. Can China make it? Can they fundamentally transform their economic and political system? A country of 1.3 billion people. We know they need to do it. World Bank just made it very clear. The Chinese government admitted it themselves. Doesn't mean they can do it. It's never been done before. It's a bet. I bet against, but it's a bet. If you have to make a bet, you bet on the United States. A lot of people do. That's why the U.S. still has the world's reserve currency. China is a system where if you want to do well at the highest levels, 52% of the GDP is, 62% of the GDP is state-owned enterprises. Absolutely, there's no rule of law, there's no transparency. You don't have as many regulations in China as the U.S. That is true. Does that mean China does capitalism better? No, it means that if you're China and you want to move a village and build a road, you can. It is not clear to me that that is capitalism in its most effective or even most rapacious form. That's the state doing what it wants to do for the state. That's the problem. You want to talk about state intervention, we've got it. We've got it in China. Look, it's unfortunate to me we're even debating this. 5 years ago, we wouldn't. It shames me. It shames me as an American because there are people out there that believe that the United States can't do capitalism as well as China. There are countries now that are doing capitalism better than the United States. If we were having this debate about Canada, we wouldn't have as much of a problem. We wouldn't, right? Look, the Chinese system is not just capitalist, it's state capitalist. State capitalism is a system where the state is the principal actor in the economy, and it uses markets ultimately for their own political gain. If it turns out that profit is useful for their political gain, they'll go for it. If it turns out it isn't, they'll go against it. And that's true whether we're talking about Chinese firms or whether we're talking about Western firms. I mean, Facebook's doing a pretty good IPO, but they're not in China. Why? China doesn't want Facebook in China. It'd make a lot of money. It'd make a lot of money for China. That's not the point, right? That's not capitalism. That's a problem. Ultimately, when we've seen state capitalism work globally, it works until it fails. And it works because despite the fact that the state is massively inefficient, and I suspect Peter admits that the state is massively inefficient, and it is in lots of forms, but it can hide its inefficiency through cheap stuff. Argentina was state capitalist, looked as good as the United States in the Western Hemisphere over 100 years ago, until they ran out of cheap land. And then they started defaulting. Venezuela looked great on cheap oil. Not so much anymore, right? China's looked great for 34 years on the basis of cheap labor. China will ultimately run out of cheap labor. So what we have in China is this extraordinary car with a huge engine going very fast down a long road. And that road has been straight for 34 years, but coming up, there's a big turn in the road. And we've never seen steering. Now, I mean, maybe, thank you, Mom, maybe they have steering, but we don't know. Another problem with Chinese state capitalism is it creates enemies. You know, there are a lot of folks around Asia. They see the Chinese economic miracle, but they're begging the United States to maintain a presence. Why? Because China does capitalism better than the United States? I don't think so. We got to watch what people do, not what people say, what they do. Did you see that piece in the Wall Street Journal? Talked about the disposition of Chinese millionaires, how over 50% of Chinese millionaires say they prefer to live in the United States than China. And yeah, it's about quality of life. Yeah, it's about the environment. Yeah, it's about opportunities for their kids. It's also about no rule of law in China and worrying about corruption and the sanctity of their assets over the long term. Now, maybe Peter believes that those 50+% of Chinese millionaires are stupid because ultimately the United States is in decline and so they shouldn't be coming here, in which case, fine, but then China's millionaires aren't that bright. And those are the entrepreneurs, so we shouldn't bet on them either way. You're in a catch-22, sir. I understand that the Chinese are saying that they don't like the U.S. dollar as a reserve currency, but where are they putting their cash? In the U.S. Now, Ron Paul and Peter say they shouldn't do that, and then we're in big trouble. Okay, well, when are they going to stop? Because I don't believe the Chinese are stupid. For me, that's not an interesting analytical model. For me, what's interesting is presuming the Chinese understand their interests, and they're putting all that money into treasuries because they believe that's safe over the long term. We are entering an environment of fear. We're entering an environment of volatility. When things get more volatile, we don't just bet on go-go growth anymore. We put our money under the mattresses. Central banks do that too. And in that environment, the world's largest economy, also ultimately the most resilient, United States of America. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ian Bremmer. Here's our motion. China does capitalism better than America. We have heard the first two speakers, and now on to the third. Orville Schell is head of the Center for U.S.-China Relations at the Asia Society. You have also written something like 9 books that have the word China in the title, and some that don't have China in the title. You know what you're talking about. Ladies and gentlemen, Orville Schell.
Well, I find myself in the awkward position being an American, deeply believing in this country and its ability to innovate and in its entrepreneurial powers to defend a Marxist-Leninist economy. And I beg you to marshal every bit of scrutiny you can to my argument, and please convince me I am wrong by voting against me at the end of this debate. I would say that the comparison between capitalism in the United States and China is as much divided by the fact that capitalism here has in many ways failed its promise. And there, in a very counterintuitive way, one we hardly have expected, the Chinese Communist Party has managed to graft on a certain kind of guerrilla mobility on the Leninist rigidity to make their system actually function in a way which I think all of us would agree over the past 3 decades has been quite extraordinary. Something none of us who were standing in the middle of Tiananmen Square in 1989, when there were 1 million people demonstrating there, thought could ever possibly happen. So I think if we look at America, we find a country that is in quite a bit of psychological self-doubt at this particular moment. We find a country that has had much of its government, many of its leaders, besieged by irrationality, religiosity. They don't believe in evolution. They don't believe in climate change. We cannot pass a simple measure in Congress to extend the national debt, which is not going to not happen. Let's quickly just look at what we see in China. I spoke of the psychological dimension of the problem in this country, and I think everybody in this room feels it. There is a sense of I think lassitude, at the same time, greed is quite a force aloft in the land. There's a great deal of self-deception at work. If you look at China, who's running the government in China now? They're all engineers. In many ways, the very things that we used to impute to China as a great weakness, namely over-reliance on ideology, are now the very things that are hampering our own country, while China, governed by engineers and technocrats, tends to look at reason. There are no climate deniers in China. I have never spoken to a Chinese who doubted evolution. China also has managed, in a way that I think it deserves our esteem, to combine the public with the private and to act when things need to be done. When a stimulus program needs to be enacted, they look at the facts and they enact it. Do you remember when we looked at 5-year plans as quaint kind of throwbacks to some retrograde period of Stalinist economics? Well, I think the United States could do with a good 5-year plan. We can't plan for 3 months ahead. I think this ability of China to marshal facts rationally, to marshal its resources and make policy and allocate capital where it needs to be allocated in times of crisis is something that our own country could learn from. I want to read a quick quote from Henny Sender from the Financial Times. The combination of Chinese SOEs and debt from state-owned banks is a powerful alliance that will increasingly resonate outside of China as well as within it. I think that's an interesting statement from a paper that's basically a laissez-faire capitalist paper. So finally, I would say that we would do well not to assume that China has nothing to teach the United States. It may be that this system will not endure in the future. It has many structural weaknesses. But to date, I would say it has been ascending, while our own form of capitalism, replete with the weaknesses that you all well know, has been in a state of decline. And whether we have the ability to grab it at the last minute from its final collapse is a question which will remain for years to come.
Thank you, Orville Schell. Our motion is China does capitalism better than America, and our final debater speaking against the motion speaks the Chinese language better than anyone on this stage. He has the advantage of having been born there, but he has been living here for decades, a professor of government at Claremont McKenna. The titles of his books and articles on China's future use phrases like China's trapped transition, looming stagnation, so we don't need to ask what he really thinks. But here's more of what he does think. Ladies and gentlemen, Minxin Pei.
I'm not going to speak in Chinese. I think the impression that China is doing capitalism better than the US is understandable. That's because it's a very superficial impression. One reason why that impression is widespread is that China has been growing fast. But there's a reason China is growing fast. Low-income countries tend to grow much faster than rich countries because they have much bigger growth potential. So what are the facts? If you look at corporate profits, US companies are far more profitable than Chinese companies. And that is to think that we can trust Chinese accounting. And then you look at tax collection. I have to disagree with Peter. He said that the Chinese state collects less taxes than the US. The opposite is true. The US government takes about federal, state, about 30% of GDP. The Chinese government collects 35%. But that's not the end of the story. Because in the US, you actually get something back from the government in the form of Social Security, health care, Medicare, Medicaid. In China, you get very little back because the bulk of government taxes is spent on government consumption. Administration, if you go to China and get treated to a 20-course meal, You say, that's great, that's Chinese hospitality. But don't forget, it's being paid for by Chinese taxpayers. Not in the USA. You do not get that kind of treatment when you go to Washington, D.C. And then you look at sort of whether China's growth is using less natural resources. And here the US is 3 times as more efficient as China. Because for every dollar of GDP produced in China, China has to consume 3 times more in terms of its natural resources, water, clean air, land. The US, in other words, is a lot more efficient. Then you look at overall economic competitiveness, because capitalism is known for its efficiency and competitiveness. Here, the US is ranked not as number 1, number 5. What about China? China is number 26, so way, way behind the US. Then you look at something like innovation ranking. The US is number 7, China is 29. You look at ease of doing business. This is by the World Bank. Because a really capitalist country should be one in which it is very easy to do business. Overall ranking for the US is number 4 in the world. China is number 91. Then starting on business, US is number 13. China is number 151. The list goes on, and I don't want to bore you. Finally, I want to imagine, what will the Politburo members think about this debate? If for some reason they've learned that in New York City, they're debating whether China does capitalism better than the US, I think their first reaction is not to laugh. Then the second reaction, they say, the Americans are really easy to impress. You stage an Olympics, they think China is number 1. So the second, the third thought that would come to their mind is that the Americans have very short memories. Because when Sputnik was launched, everybody thought the Soviet Union was to dominate the world. And then in the late 1980s, I think in this city, people should have good memories about who was buying the Rockefeller Center, right? Japan was dominating the headlines. Everybody thought Japan was doing capitalism better than the US. Now look at where Japan is after 20 years. So I think what we are seeing here is not that China does capitalism better than the US. We are experiencing a period of self-doubt. The real issue is about the US. US can do capitalism much better than it does. But China, at least for the moment and for the foreseeable future, will not be doing capitalism anywhere better, anywhere close to the US in terms of competition, efficiency, even social justice. Thank you.
Thank you, Minxin Pei. Now on to round 2 of this Intelligence Squared U.S. debate. This is where the debaters address each other directly and answer questions from the audience and from me. We have here 2 teams of 2 who are arguing out this motion: China does capitalism better than America. We've heard the team arguing in support of the motion, Peter Schiff and Orville Schell, basically saying that China does capitalism better because there's actually more freedom to do things that involve capitalism, that there are fewer regulations, that there are lower taxes. It is not pure capitalism, and they're not arguing that, but they're saying that it's more pure than the U.S. has had in the last 100 years. The team arguing against the motion, Ian Bremmer and Minxin Pei, they're making the argument that what China's doing, even if it could be called capitalism, is something that's probably cruising for a crash. That when the government is the biggest player in the market, as they argue that it is, point out that it is, this tends to lead to corruption and to cronyism and ultimately to exposure of the lack of real innovation. So I want to take a question from this side's argument to that side, and that's that argument that what we're seeing from China, this enormous growth rate, your opponents have pointed out, number one is the result of China coming off a much lower baseline. When things get really volatile, things can really fall apart there. And they're essentially saying that what's happening in China over the long haul is a blip. Is it a blip? Peter
Well,
Schiff.
I mean, first of all, there are a lot of countries that are starting on low baselines that are not having any kind of economic growth at all. As far as whether the trajectory is sustainable. I think not only is it just sustainable, but I think it's going to get better because the real country that's headed for a crisis is America. And I think what's dragging the Chinese down is their currency peg. They're loaning America all this money so America can keep buying the products that Americans really can't afford. And so as a result, the Chinese are debasing their currency and they're creating a lot of inflation, which is destabilizing their economy and I think undermining the standard of living of their own citizens, which would be rising even faster if the Chinese government simply let the RMB rise in value, let the dollar...
So if that is so unwise by the Chinese government, is this a blip period for them then?
Well, I think they're gonna figure this out, and they're not gonna play this game anymore. And the real crash is coming here because then interest rates skyrocket, the dollar tanks, consumer prices go through the roof, and we have our Greek moment. Only there's no Europe to bail us out.
Ian Bremmer, do you want to respond?
Well, yeah, we're not heading for a Greek moment. I mean, comparing us with Greece is almost as ludicrous as comparing us
It's not fair to the Greeks.
I don't think you even believe that, but leave it aside. Look, I mean...
You got to read my books.
No, I'll get there. I'll get there. Look, with the United States has so many strong intrinsic advantages in terms of not just the matter of where the dollar sits, but also, I mean, 30% of the world's calories come from the United States. People increasingly fighting over food. That's a real problem for China. The environment in China is absolutely falling apart. If you look at environment-adjusted GDP, it's so much worse than the growth you see presently. We already heard from Minxin about just how much more profitable American multinationals are than Chinese SOEs, and yet that China's moving more in the direction towards SOEs, not towards private sector, especially since 2008. All of these things are problematic, and the ability of the Chinese to suddenly make a decision to go away from the dollar, you have to go into something. What exactly are you going into? You're going into the euro in an enormous way? I don't see that in terms of massive growth opportunities. You're going into Japan? We already said we had 2 lost decades there. You're going to go into gold or hard commodities? You can do some of that. You can only do so much. And as you go away from the dollar, you, of course, ruin the position that you have in the rest of those dollars. So China's not going to do that. They haven't. And they're not going
Orville
to.
Schell, let's bring you into the debate.
You know, this isn't exclusively about one country or another. We're doing a comparison here. And we're talking about recent history, not an idealized America, and we'd be very foolish to idealize China. And I think what we have to reckon with is the chances of each country finding a new state of equipoise, the United States included. I think what's going on in Washington right now is so utterly mad and broken that I put no confidence whatsoever in their ability to play that essential role that every government, and I may disagree with you here, Peter, but every government must play. And we are not playing it.
And Orville Schell, you, in making that point before, you went on to say that you think that the model of planning, which we used to think was quaint and slightly ridiculous, maybe we should be looking at a new light now. Minxin Pei, what about that? Is a little planning a good thing after all? Or
China,
a lot of planning?
They plan a lot, except they do nothing about the plans they draw up. Because if you look at Chinese 5-year plans, you think, my gosh, these guys are very strategic. Then 5 years later, and you do some kind of plan accounting, and you see what has been accomplished, very little. Because if they had actually followed through on their promises, China today will indeed be doing capitalism a lot better than the U.S.
Peter Schiff.
Well,
Do you want to respond to that point?
Well, not that particular point, but there's some other points that he made earlier that
All right.
that I
Tell us what the point was and go for it.
Well, first of all, one of the things that you mentioned, you said that American citizens, we get all kinds of benefits from our government that the Chinese citizens don't get. Well, I would say that we get a lot more liability. If you try to figure out what each American share is of the national debt, it is enormous. And if you're talking about capitalism, you're defending capitalism by saying we get Social Security. What's capitalistic about a centrally planned retirement system that's financed like Bernie Madoff ran his investment business? I think it's much better that the Chinese are free to keep their income and plan for their own retirement.
Minxin Pei,
Okay.
take on the question of whether the existence of Social Security compromises the U.S. claim to be capitalist, which I think is Peter's point.
I don't think so, because capitalism produces efficiency, but it also has a lot of risks. Modern capitalist societies are a lot riskier than traditional agrarian societies, because in a modern capitalist society, once you lose your job, you really have no source of income. You cannot grow your own potatoes. Let me just say something about China. The debt we know about, because Peter said that in the U.S., every citizen gets a lot of, shoulders is responsible for a lot of government debt. The same thing is true of China, because the Chinese national debt is actually higher than the American debt. In China,
What are you talking about?
okay, in China, the nominal debt is low, 20%, but the Chinese government knows better than Bernie Madoff. Okay, does a much better job in hiding its liabilities. The trouble with the Chinese people is that after paying taxes, having their government incur so much debt, they get no social security. They get no social protection. So that's why I think even capitalists are coming to this country to enjoy some kind of protection.
Wait a minute. China is trying to implement a healthcare system, a social security system, and when you say the Chinese people have gotten nothing out of the last 30 years of development, you have surely seen the infrastructure that China has built, which benefits everybody in some way or other.
Orville, take 10, 15 seconds to describe specifically the kind of infrastructure you're talking about. Housing, roads.
You look at the highway system, you look at the rail system. We haven't built a tunnel in New York City since the 1920s and the 1930s. China's throwing these things up overnight. Bridges, subway systems, you name it. Now, I don't want to idealize China's system, but I do want to, give credit where credit is due, and it is unfair to say that no benefit is derived from the amazing development of the last 30 years.
Does this side concede that point?
No, I don't concede that point at all.
Well, it's not. It's also
Ian Bremmer,
Yeah,
do you want to come in on this?
I wouldn't say that, to say that Chinese get nothing, of course, is ludicrous. That's like comparing the United States to Greece. We don't want to do that, right? They're clearly, Chinese citizens are doing better on average than they were before. There's no question. Although, if you ask where a lot of the profitability from that development has gone, it's gone to the United States. I mean, you look at Apple, you look at the manufacturing of the iPad, $10 is captured by China, and about 60 goes back to Apple and its shareholders, most of whom are Americans. I like that trade. Right? I mean, there's a reason why American multinationals actually do better. Look, we have a problem in the United States that increasingly a large percentage of Americans, right, a book that I think you probably have read by Charles Murray, Coming Apart, increasingly, they're not doing as well. They don't have as much opportunity. We have to address that, because if not, long term, those folks are going to get upset. But they're not going to be as upset as the hundreds of millions of Chinese that will eventually face a crash and will have no opportunity, no option to really revolt against.
We still live pretty good because we're able to borrow all this money. We have a phony economy that is perpetuated based on debt. When this debt bubble bursts and this whole thing comes toppling down, it's going to be a whole different story.
Orville Schell.
Well, the real question is the sustainability of our own enterprise. Ian, you've just written a wonderful book called Every Nation for Itself, and I thought it very interesting to read the following. You talk about the serious psychological toll in this country of the financial crisis and the near economic collapse. And you say, worse still is the fear that America's leaders can't fix these problems because the U.S. political system is broken beyond repair. Is it?
No, that's the fear that they believe that.
And you believe that we will regain our sense and be able to restore reason to our decision-making and pull out of this nadir of...
I thought it was interesting that you brought up the fact that, the United States government, was trying to get this 1.2, 1.4 trillion in reductions passed. The Democrats and Republicans had a basic agreement about it. Some of it was Iraq, some Afghanistan, some was going to be increased airline fees, some was going to be reductions in agricultural subsidies. It was fairly easy to do, and at the last minute they decided not to do it. But in part, the reason they decided not to do it is because they're not being pressured. In Europe, one second, I know you're excited. In Europe, right, in Europe, right, they are being pressured and they're finally acting. And it got really ugly before it had to happen. Look, the unfortunate lesson that we are all learning since 2008, the world is getting faster, governments are not getting faster. And that's true in the United States, we're kicking the can. It's true in Europe, they've done a lot of kicking the can, Japan. But the largest can getting kicked hardest down the road is the Chinese can.
Minxin Pei, there's a lot of pessimism about the U.S. on this side. That's a fair way to argue this because this is a two-part argument, China up and US down. So they're more heavily, I would say, on US down than China up. You guys are...
Well, people inside China are not very optimistic either about the country's future prospects. The high growth period for China is over. I urge you to read the World Bank's latest report on China called China 2030. It's free for downloading on World Bank's website. This is what it says. From now on until 2030, if China does well, its average growth will be somewhere between 6 and 7%. And if China does not do the set of reforms the World Bank recommended, probably China cannot even achieve a much reduced level of growth, because China is coming into an era where savings will be a lot lower, the population will be a lot older, the environmental costs will be a lot more visible. If you, I'm sure a lot of you have been to Beijing. In the future, when you're Beijing, you should bring along a spacesuit.
I want to go to audience questions now.
I'm Norbert Swisslocke. I lived in China for 5 years. Chinese workers are known for their hard work. This is a question on labor. To what extent does the labor market in China fuel Chinese economy, whereas the labor market in the United States seems to thwart it?
How is that statement ammunition for you on this motion?
Oh, that for the motion, which is that if you look at the labor market per se, you would say China's labor market is not as free, as well developed, or even regulated than the U.S.
Right in the center, sir.
Thank you very much. My question is for the panelists in favor of the motion. While you're arguing the same conclusion, it seems to me that your premises are at odds with each other, if I understand them correctly. On the one hand, Mr. Schell seems to say that for America to do capitalism better, we need more top-down planning by government, presumably, while Mr. Schiff is arguing that we need much less of that and more undirected, bottom-up economy. Could you reconcile the drivers behind your conclusions?
I want to see this.
The complex answer to your question is no.
Yeah, I guess it'd be a debate within a debate, but yeah, I mean, I don't think the solution is for America to become less free and to try to emulate what China does wrong, but to pick up on what China's doing right. And I think China needs to do the same thing, not follow the poor example of modern America and all the things that we've done to wreck our capitalist economy, but to turn back the clock and to try to incorporate the system and the values that were enshrined in the Constitution by the framers. I think that is real capitalism.
Hi, my name is McKinnon Webster. I was curious that no one mentioned human rights once this evening, and I'm wondering if you think that that plays a role in a debate on capitalism.
You know, I think
Orville Schell.
the United States has, over the last decade, been not exactly exemplary as an evangelist for human rights, which has stilled our voice to some degree. And this is an aspect of the Chinese system which is not exemplary. And we don't need to and wouldn't want to imitate it. But having said that, I think we have to be honest that authoritarian capitalism has been able to do things that a freer form of capitalism sometimes fails to be able to do.
Look, that's
Ian
certainly
Bremmer
true.
was-
I mean, God forbid you're forced to hire disabled people, right?
Right.
Yes, but we can't compare human rights in the United States with China, obviously. The U.S. still does a lot of things wrong. It's like this broader debate. The U.S. does a lot of things wrong on capitalism, but it's still vastly more effective than China. The U.S. has a lot of problems in human rights, but China isn't in the same league, right, and on the same league sheets. Let's be very clear. And while I think that a certain level of human rights abuses facilitates rapacious capitalism, especially in the short term, in the long term, it will bite you in the hiney, right? And there are other places that you get problems too. I did talk about transparency and the fact that places like Facebook and Google and Twitter are a problem for China because they want to own that data, they want to control it, they want to shape it, they want Chinese state internet just like they have state capitalism. That's a problem for them. When I think about responses in terms of general transparency, In the United States, you do actually know largely what your officials are up to. Look, Solyndra was a disaster. It's a bad thing for the United States. Peter and I will agree on that, right? But we found out about it, right? And we found, and it was on balance. I mean, people got egg on face. In China, they don't want to tell you about Solyndra. You don't have media that's getting inside the dirty laundry of serious Chinese officials. They are engineers that run the country. They're also billionaires. Let's remember that, okay? And that's the problem of the lack of human rights and transparency in China. It doesn't facilitate creative destruction. It doesn't facilitate allowing the Chinese people to take advantage of a free market. Maybe the Chinese people would be just as good capitalists as we are, but unfortunately, their system doesn't allow it to be. That's a problem.
Hi, my name is Guy Wiggins. I just wanted to hear from the panel their thoughts on how the one-child policy has affected capitalism in China and what the future means when you have far more men than women, and how that's going to basically, I think, lead to all kinds of irrationalities and inefficiencies in the market.
I wondered how you were going to turn that to the motion. That was very good. That was very good. Orville Schell.
Here I would say the advantage is emphatically on the American side because we have immigration. China does not, and China has one of the most rapidly aging populations, and the lower reaches are not being replenished with the one-child policy, so it's going to have a huge burden of taking care of elderly people and not have younger people coming in on the bottom to support them. That's going to be a giant problem.
I want to ask each panel how you define capitalism.
Rather than go 1, 2, 3, 4, I just want to let each side pick somebody to answer that question, assuming you agree with each other.
Capitalism, to me, is where the means of production are controlled completely privately, where the factors of production, land, labor, and capital are allocated through a market, where prices for all goods and services, wages, interest rates are set by the market, as opposed to a centrally planned or socialist economy where a lot of these decisions are made by bureaucrats and where the means of production is being micromanaged from a centrally planned authority, where they're making decisions based on politics. This should be produced, that should be produced, this should be favored, that should be favored. And whether the government does it directly, like a communist would, by nationalizing the means of production and actually owning them, or whether it takes a different route by controlling them through the tax code, through what it taxes and what it subsidies and how it regulates and what businesses it favors and what it punishes. When you start doing that, you don't have capitalism, you have something else.
So by that definition, neither China nor the United States is capitalism.
Well, that's what I started. I said the question should be which country does it worse, not which one does it better.
Well,
Minxin Pei.
I cannot have said it better. I think that's the best description of the Chinese economic system. The part about what capitalism is not. But I would add one more thing. I think modern capitalism also has a legal system, the rule of law. Without the rule of law, there can be no capitalism. And China does not have rule of law.
Sir.
I'm Peter Goodman with the Huffington Post and former Shanghai bureau chief of the Washington Post. I want to get your thoughts on how the growth slowdown plays out in China. Does that cause the state to double down on the state-owned sector and hang on to control state-owned enterprises, or does it tend toward more liberalization and attempt to get a little more vibrance out of the private sector?
As the World Bank's diagnosis shows that the slowdown is coming, no matter what. The debate is when it's going to happen and the speed at which the slowdown is going to happen. What the Chinese government is going to respond when there are two paths. One is to double down, as you said, to do the things they've been doing. That is a lot of investment in infrastructure that's going to yield decreasing returns, and growth will continue to slow, and that will be a dead end. The other will be a very different trajectory. That is to really become capitalist, which means to increase domestic consumption, to allocate capital much more efficiently. Incidentally, in China, the capital market, as we know it, does not exist. Most of the savings is allocated through state-controlled banking sector. So they've got to change that. And they've got to privatize state-owned enterprises. Lots and lots of things that can be done to avert that kind of dramatic slowdown. But that means China will have to do capitalism.
Peter Schiff.
Well, I think ultimately, and this is a bet that I'm making, that the Chinese are going to make, is the biggest problem that is impeding economic growth in China is their currency peg. And the misallocations of resources that are being created in that economy by their desire to prop up the dollar so that American consumers can keep buying Chinese products when in effect we're too poor to buy those products because we have nothing to export to pay for them. And I do believe that the Chinese are going to see the error of their ways, and when they allow this change to happen, when they allow an appreciation in the value of their currency, and they allow their citizens to more fully reap the rewards of their hard work and their savings, I think you're going to see a much greater growth trajectory in China. And I think a lot of some of the problems that we're discussing here will go away as the Chinese economy is allowed to prosper and the government gets out of the way and lets it happen.
Okay, we have time for one more question. And last question, sir. Blue shirt.
Hello, my name is Ed Sapin. First of all, thank you all for being here tonight. It's pretty striking to me. We've been talking about capitalism. I haven't really heard much discussion about entrepreneurship. So I'd be curious to hear from the panelists, what's your view of the link between entrepreneurship and capitalism, and which country does it better?
Orville Schell?
Well, I have to say, I mean, this is something America does exceedingly well. This is the part of American capitalism that really works. Our innovation, our scaling, bringing stuff to market, scaling it up, Silicon Valley. And China does this less well, but I have to say, I've been around this block for a number of decades, and what I see happening in China is a lot of incredibly interesting self-made entrepreneurs bubbling up from underneath. Where they go, where the private sector of the economy goes, can it become the majority sector? That remains to be seen. But this is a very vibrant place. Don't write it off for 1 second.
There is innovation.
There is innovation, not full spectrum. They don't have Nobel laureates yet at this far end. But there is innovation. These guys are crafty, they're good, they're smart, and boy, they're on a roll.
Minxin Pei.
These are the facts. If you are a private entrepreneur in China, you cannot open a private bank. You cannot get into telecom services. You cannot get into energy. You cannot get into national resources. You cannot get into 14 other very important sectors because these are the sectors reserved for state-owned companies. You cannot get bank loans. You don't have secure property rights. If you get into a dispute with another entrepreneur, with another businessman, whether you win that dispute does not depend on whether you have a good case. It depends on whether you know the Communist Party secretary in charge of the legal system.
And that concludes round 2 of this Intelligence Squared U.S. debate. And here's where we are. We are about to hear brief closing statements from each debater in turn. They will be 2 minutes each. Remember how you voted before the debate, because this is their last chance to convince you that they have argued best. And you're going to be asked to vote again once they finish these statements a few minutes from now, and you will pick the winner by doing so. But first, on to round 3, closing statements by each debater in turn. Our motion is China does capitalism better than America, and here to summarize his position against the motion, Ian Bremmer. He is president of Eurasia Group and author of the upcoming book, Every Nation for Itself, Winners and Losers in a G0 World.
Thank you very much. My colleague, partner Minxin, just talked about all the things you couldn't do to set up in China in terms of entrepreneurship, but he didn't mention fruit stands. Those you can, and perhaps there's a Tunisian model in the future for China. I think it's an interesting question. Look, I thought I would end with the future. One of the things the United States does better than anyone else in the world is creative destruction. I like independent bookstores, but I tell you, when Amazon came along, right, they got smashed. That may not be a society that you all want to live in. You may like independent bookstores, but a society does capitalism better. And we see that all over the place. Creative destruction is what powers the American market. I know that the Chinese are doing more patents. They're small, they're engineering patents, there's slight improvements on processes. Don't take away from them. They're very smart in China, they're being educated well, they're great. But if you want to talk about the game-changing stuff that you want to bet on that's going to make the world work over the next 20 years, overwhelmingly that stuff is being driven in the United States of America. I don't know if it's Bill Gates' new battery technology that's going to work and be the next game changer. It's going to be in biotech, it's going to be in nanotech. But if you want to make that bet, and by the way, the Chinese central bank wants to make it too, You're going to make it here. I love the fact that we live in a society as well where broad ideologies can come together, work together, and make lots of money. I applaud the fact that we live in a place that a guy like Peter Schiff can make an enormous coin for himself, and I think you guys should too. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ian Bremmer. Our motion is China does capitalism better than America. And now, to summarize his position for the motion, Peter Schiff, he is CEO and Chief Global Strategist of Euro-Pacific Capital. He is also author of the upcoming book, The Real Crash, A Blueprint for a Bankrupt America. Peter Schiff.
Rebuilding. I think, part of the problem having this debate at this particular point in time, it would kind of be like having a debate in 2005 over which country does real estate better, the United States or China. Because in 2005, everybody thought it was great in the U.S. for the housing market. Everybody was buying a house, even the people that couldn't afford them. Everybody had second homes, and it was great. But, of course, it was a bubble, and it couldn't last. And that's the same thing with the U.S. economy. If you want to look at the U.S. economy and measure it by how much money we spend and how much we consume, and the Chinese, they're not making a big bet on the U.S. Treasury market because they want to. It's because they think they have to. If they can wave a wand and replace all their treasuries with gold, they do it. The problem is they're afraid because they know if they try to sell, they'll crush the market. But we are on the verge of this collapse, and it's because we abandon all the principles of capitalism that we once had. And these are the principles that China is now adopting. And as I said earlier, what's really more important is the pendulum and the direction in which it's swinging. Look at where we started from complete capitalism, and China started, they had none of it. And look at how much ground we've surrendered, and look at how much the Chinese have gained.
Thank you, Peter Schiff. Our motion is China does capitalism better than America, and here to summarize his position against the motion, Minxin Pei, professor of government at Claremont McKenna and author of China's Trapped Transition, The Limits of Developmental Autocracy.
Does China do capitalism better than the US? We have to add one adjective. China does do a certain kind of capitalism better than the US. That's crony capitalism. And I don't think Americans want to excel in that category. Because in China, under that kind of capitalism, you're not going to get clean air to breathe. You're afraid to buy baby formula, because if you have babies in the household, you better go to Hong Kong to buy imported baby formula, because crony capitalism cannot provide food safety. And if you are part of the elite, crony capitalism serves you really well, because I've read that elites in China, political elites, are now installing air filtering systems in their cars, in their homes. But what about ordinary people? The vision of capitalism Peter champions is a vision of 19th century capitalism. Thank God, America has come a long way and will not go back. Let's also imagine 20 years from now, which system will be there? I can safely bet 20 years from now, democracy, democratic capitalism will still be around in the US. But can you say this about the Communist Party in China? So at the end of the day, it will be American capitalism that triumphs over crony capitalism.
Thank you, Minxin Pei. This is our motion, China does capitalism better than America. And here to summarize his position in support of the motion, Orville Schell, an award-winning journalist and director of Asia Society Center on U.S.-China Relations.
Well, Minxin, amen. I really want to agree with you, and I truly hope you're right. It would be nice. But who would have thought 5 or 10 years ago that we would be sitting here tonight, even having this debate, that there would be any kind of equilibrium even to discuss between these two great economic systems? No one. 20 years ago, impossible. 30 years ago, when I first went to China, it was unthinkable. China is undeniably in transition. We are a more finished product trying to regain our balance. And I worry about the United States. I think we have a good model, but I think we haven't played it very well. I think we've deceived ourselves. I think we've fallen into a lot of self-deception about what has made this country great and strong. It's a combination between regulation and control and wisdom at the top, setting an equitable and fair system, and a free market with a vibrant set of entrepreneurs and innovators at the bottom. And I think everyone in this room should acknowledge that despite all its imperfections, despite the human rights questions, despite all of these other things, that what China has accomplished, as counterintuitive as it was, no one could have predicted it, is pretty extraordinary. Something has been working pretty well. We don't know where it's going to go in the future. And all we can do is sit and wait. But if we want to fix something, we're not going to fix China. The question is, are we going to fix ourselves?
Thank you, Orville Schell. And that concludes our closing statements. And now it's time to learn which side our live audience feels has argued best. We're going to ask you to go to the keypad at your seat that will register your vote. We have asked you to vote twice, once before the debate and once again after the debate. This is the final result on who wins this argument. According to our live audience here, our motion is China does capitalism better than America. Before the debate, 17% of you were in favor of the motion, 50% against, and 33% undecided. After the debate, 9% are for the motion, that's down 8%. 85% support the motion, that's up 35%. 6% are undecided. The team arguing against the motion, China does capitalism better than America, wins this debate. Our congratulations to them. And thank you from me, John Donvan, and Intelligence Squared US. We will see you next time.